Well, thank you for the invitation. Very much appreciated. And always very good to come back to Copenhagen. The last time I was here was in 2013, and the event was a workshop on ecosystem overviews. And the idea was to develop the ICES ecosystem overview format by including things like human and environmental pressures and ecosystem states. So that meeting was chaired by Simon Jennings, and it was quite an event. So here's the title of my talk. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in IEA implementation, but what I'm going to do is highlight how the production of ecosystem status reports or overviews advanced our understanding of the structure and function of offshore marine ecosystems of the Northwest Atlantic. And while I was preparing this, I came across this cartoon, and it immediately reminded me of Patrizio telling me about the achievements, the really big achievements that Mission Atlantic was making over the past few years. So you can tell which one's Patrizio. Okay, so most of you have seen a map of Canada or know where Canada is. It's surrounded by three oceans, the Atlantic, Pacific, and the Arctic. Unfortunately, our neighbor to the south has become unfriendly towards us, so that's not necessarily a good thing. So Canada is generally known for and proud of a number of things. Ice hockey is one of them. Our Royal Canadian Mounted Police, lumberjacks, maple syrup, and then the emblem for the Canadian flag, the maple leaves. But we also have abundant natural resources, beavers, moose, and commercial fisheries, both in freshwater and marine systems. What we're not so proud of is the fact that during the early 1990s, we had a major collapse of a dominant predator in the marine food chain, and this was cod. So the decline was quite extreme. The round dots show management units for 5 different cod stocks that were formerly quite productive. The one in orange was once one of the largest cod stocks in the North Atlantic, the northern cod. So relative to the early 90s, the magnitude of the decline relative to the highs in the 1960s resulted in a massive decline, 99% decline, and the other 4 stocks equally dramatic. What was interesting as well is these declines occurred pretty much in synchrony. So when we had data on all 5 stocks, you can see that they pretty much went up and down in synchrony. And this was in relation to the fishing mortalities that had occurred on those stocks. So as fishing mortality was low, the biomasses were high, and when fishing mortalities were high, the biomasses were low. And you can see in the late or early 1990s how extreme fishing mortalities were in terms of presenting these as stacked histograms. So this caught the attention of the media. In '94, a newspaper article by David Suzuki called this event an ecological apocalypse. Those that you have not heard of David Suzuki, he's kind of our Canadian David Attenborough. So this was something that really caught the attention of the country. I also caught the attention of many authors, some of whom were non-scientific. Here are a few of the books that were written about the cod collapse. Some of them have very provocative titles. There's one entitled Managed Annihilation, and then Mismanagement of Marine Fisheries by Ellen Longhurst. Also, many dozens of scientific publications have followed. So there was lots of finger pointing, blame for what caused the collapse, overfishing, primarily domestic and foreign were leading causes. The domestic fishery blamed the foreign fishery, of course. Environment, cold water, and redistribution were potential causes, as well as predation by seals and starvation, and maybe some combination of all of the above. Basically, this raised the specter that natural mortality was not a constant. That is, it's a time-varying parameter, and at the time, we generally weren't aware of that. And to this day, there are still retrospective studies examining what led to the collapse. A recent paper by Sear and others talking about environmental control of cod productivity, and one in 2022 assessing the role of starvation mortality associated with the collapse. So shortly after collapse, a fishing moratorium was established in July of 1992. This wasn't a recommendation from assessment scientists. Assessment scientists made projections for the 1992 catch options, but these were fairly low, and our Minister of Fisheries decided that a moratorium should be imposed. And at the time, the guiding principle was that the effects of fishing were reversible. So if we close the fishery, the biomass should increase. And as we saw on the previous slide, there did seem to be an inverse relationship between stock biomass and fishing mortality. So the prediction was that after 2 years of a fishing moratorium, the stock would increase by tenfold. And here was the prediction at the time. So a plot of the spawning stock biomass and the projected increase in 1994. 2 levels were given, but these were both levels that hadn't been seen in over 2 decades and were similar to the levels in the early 1970s. But in reality, there was no recovery despite the moratorium. Here's the same plot, but extended out to 2010, and it shows the historical changes in the stock biomass as well as the survey estimates in black, and the limit reference point as a dashed line. And the moratorium lasted until 2024, so there was basically no recovery up until that time, or limited. So this was pretty shocking. The failure to recover was completely unexpected. I would say that the foundations for fisheries management were shaken. The moratorium was implemented in other cod management units, and there were similar outcomes. And it revealed major weaknesses in our understanding of the functioning of marine ecosystems. You might say we got lost in the details of single species stock assessments. There was a little bit of good news coming out of this, and that is the collapse generated research on large-scale disturbances, overfishing primarily, and environmental effects on populations, communities, and ecosystems. So if we fast forward, I don't have time to dwell on each of the findings, but basically what we discovered was firstly fairly obvious that fishing effects weren't easy to reverse, either at the population, species, community, ecosystem level, and the answers were elusive when we were examining the dynamics of the affected species alone. We found that thresholds exist in terms of population size and exploitation levels, so that some marine fisheries, by looking broadly, persist and others collapse in the face of similar exploitation regimes. And there are important influences of the ambient temperatures, species richness, and compensation by functionally similar species. Also, we documented the occurrence of regime shifts, alternate states, particularly when groundfish collapsed. It tended to result in a dominance by former prey, such as small pelagic species and macroinvertebrates. And we also discovered that overfishing effects can alter the structure of marine ecosystems and cascade to lower trophic levels, but this too was context dependent. So what led to these findings? At least in my case, it was the formation of a multi-disciplinary working group whose task was to assess the status of a marine ecosystem. So instead of conducting stock assessments, which I had been doing, the director of my institute asked me if I would conduct an ecosystem assessment, which I gladly accepted. And at this time, there was the development of ecosystems assessment and status reports being conducted by NOAA and ICES. So it was really timely to begin that kind of work. And we asked really three simple questions before we started, and we wanted to know if the ecosystem that we had chosen, if it had changed over time. If it did change, was the magnitude and direction similar to past observations? And I guess you can't see that, but if it did change, or was it a healthy ecosystem? And in that sense, we were looking at components of the ecosystem. So this is the report that we produced back in 2003. It was based on an analysis of more than 60 time series of biotic, abiotic, and human-related activities. And we did this with a team of specialists to conduct this evaluation. And we produced this kind of heat map. You've probably seen this in many of the ICES ecosystem overviews. It shows all of the different metrics that were used, and they're portrayed as standardized anomalies in terms of green being above average or positive and red being negative or below average. And you can see that there are blocks of red and green. Well, these are ordered in terms of how the anomalies changed or similarity of change over time. So there's a block that represented the early high productivity of the groundfish community, which gave way to a community that was more dominated by small pelagic fishes and macroinvertebrates. And this served as the foundation for many follow-on studies. But one thing that we did do with this data was we're trying to drill down to it. So we kind of isolated the components that related to the food web or food chain. So the top panel shows the combined abundance of landings from a suite of groundfish species, and you can see how that changes over time, declining strongly. The pelagic fish biomass increasing, also increases in the invertebrate community, mainly snow crab and shrimp. We also saw some evidence of a reciprocal change in large-bodied zooplankton, although there is a data gap. Same true for the phytoplankton, which again was inversely related to the zooplankton, and it appeared as though there may have been effects that penetrated to the very base of the food chain. And at the same time, an expanding gray seal population was occurring. Also, there was an intensification of the vertical stratification in the water column. So this all came out of the ecosystem status report. We hadn't really set out to evaluate these kinds of dynamics, but it was a product of the collation of that broad base of data. So in terms of answering the three questions, yes, the system did change. It wasn't similar to what we had seen in the past, and some of the components of the ecosystem really were unhealthy. And the more detailed answers to these questions were contained in a series of publications, again emanating from the ecosystem working group that we were part of. Okay, so you thought, or you might have thought, that this would have a big effect on the way we were managing our fisheries. But in fact, it didn't result in any meaningful changes in the approach to fisheries management. Instead, The collapse of the groundfish generated the expansion and development of new fisheries. There was a proliferation of fisheries for former prey species and for data-poor species. And I really think we missed an opportunity to balance the demands of a multi-species fishery. So for the Scotian Shelf, here's an example from a paper in 2008 where they were comparing the landed value of different groups of fish species from 1988 to 2000. With respect to the established fisheries, this would be groundfish primarily, there was a 50% reduction overall in the revenue generated. We certainly failed to maintain their productivity, but for the developing fisheries and emerging fisheries, there was massive increases. Spiny dogfish, snow crab, northern shrimp, as well as a host of other crab species and shellfish. So for many, we had really no basic biological knowledge about these species and what their ecological role in the food chain was. On the Newfoundland shelf, during the cod moratorium, over 3 million tons of prey for cod were harvested. So this is the period during the moratorium. Those are landings of 3 species, capelin, snow crab, and shrimp. And you can see quite a active fishery taking place with some evidence of, for shrimp in particular, of overfishing effects. So basically a lack of a holistic approach here. The assessments of these 3 species were generally conducted in isolation from one another. So no one was at the table arguing for an allotment or a reduction in the TACs to satisfy the consumptive demands of cod and other groundfish. So I mentioned that the moratorium ended in 2024. So here's a headlines from a news article in June of 2024 hailing the end of the cod moratorium. Moratorium is defined as a temporary prohibition or suspension of activity. But in reality, these were the commercial, recreational, and sentinel fisheries landings during the moratorium. Over 175,000 tons were landed, and this is probably an underestimate given that the recreational fishery was poorly monitored and regulated. And it was really only closed for 2 brief periods. So this was basically a myth. So the cod moratorium was a myth. If we look at the historical perspective of northern cod, you can see that during this moratorium period, very little recovery relative to what was considered a limit reference point of around 350,000 metric tons. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that the stock has only experienced a slight recovery. So our experience and that of NOAA and ICES was that some of the most successful engagement between DFO and the fishing industry, policymakers, senior managers, and general public came through the presentation of ecosystem status reports. It seemed to provide a greater understanding or belief of knowing the linkages between components of the ecosystem that were previously unknown or underappreciated. It resulted in support and expansion of monitoring programs to provide annual estimates of trends in physical, chemical, and lower trophic level properties of ecosystems to complement the existing research vessel surveys. And in this sense, it was this idea of a macroscope where you try to look at a system from a holistic perspective. The macroscope was an idea put forth by Howard Odum, who was a famous ecologist who advocated the use of systems theory in ecology. And the multidisciplinary working groups were really essential. They exposed specialists to other specialists, resulting in knowledge exchange, enhanced communication, and many unforeseen innovations. So Summing up, missed opportunities for an ecosystem approach had occurred within our Canadian management system. Unfortunately, the ecosystem status reports that we began in the 2000s have largely been forgotten in favor of other priorities. There's a large focus on rebuilding and recovery plans of different species, largely from a single species perspective. And only recently has a call for resumption of this previous work been initiated. And here I refer to a recent paper by Pepin in 2022, where they're talking about a need to develop integrated management approaches such as regional ecosystem assessments and approaches that combine modeling and empirical analyses. They end in a statement with DFO is currently developing a national strategy to initiate an ecosystem approach to fisheries management for the development of single stock advice. So encouraging signs, but obviously moving very slowly. And with that, I'll end my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the overview of what it is anyway a very interesting story and historical perspective. I'm sure there will be questions in the room, and start warming up and raising your hand. I can start with one just to break the ice. The value of the ecosystem approach to understanding some of these dynamics, of course, I mean, you show that there are a lot of components that needs to be considered to understand the dynamic of the cod fishery. Of course, the difficult step is to translate that scientific knowledge into some form of advice on what to do, especially in the context of an ecosystem approach, because there are a lot of trade-offs. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that? I mean, well, how can we solve that dilemma in a sense?
Well, I think one way is there are many systems where if a top predator is depleted, sometimes there's a compensatory dynamics, so another one will step in place. So on the Scotian Shelf, dogfish was kind of the functional substitute for some of the groundfish species. So the advice we were giving was don't overfish those because that may not, or that may maintain the structure of the food web. So maintaining that kind of structure was why we had argued that go slow on the development of the dogfish fishery, which wasn't followed. I think the other way is to have stock assessments conducted in groups with people of, like have somebody there with the prey species, the predator species. Now, we've tried that, and that can be very difficult because the methodologies between assessing different types of species are very different. Some are very data rich, some are data poor. The methodologies used in the assessments are different. So in that exercise, we found that when we were doing the data-rich groundfish assessments, most of the invertebrate people or scientists weren't familiar with the methodologies, didn't feel they could provide any technical input. It was pretty difficult, and in fact, many of them left the room and came back when it was their turn. So it didn't have the dynamic that we thought it would. So, and it's kind of too late after you run through all the assessments and then try to do sort of like a post synthesis. So it's a pretty complicated problem, managing multi-species fisheries.
But in terms of the approach you were following in that type of discussions there, we're still kind of focusing on the functioning of the different groups within the food web.
Yes.
Okay, that's at least something that was agreed upon.
Yeah, and as it looks like after many years, there is an intention to redevelop or further develop what we had started a few decades ago.
Okay. Thanks. Questions, Benjamin?
Yeah, thank you very much for the historical perspective. I'd like to fall back on this moving slowly issue. Last week, we had the IEA, the Integrated Ecosystem Assessment Group for the Norwegian Sea, and we had meetings with stakeholders from the industry and from the fisheries management authorities. And an interesting feedback from them was from the fisheries management authorities. They're ready to take in IEA work if it fits in through the system that's already in place, which is mostly single stock management. But the industry was ready to take in the information we're providing immediately, because they can use it in many different ways. They're very flexible in using that information. And we got invited to actually present this, the results of the IEA to the industry in 2 weeks from now. So I think it's a very different way. The two groups are getting that information. And I was wondering if you experienced the same thing in Canada, that actually the difficulty or the slowness in implementing IEA might be more in the fisheries management administration than in the industry itself.
Yeah, excellent point. Yeah, I think that's part of it as well. The fisheries managers, going way back, so when the cod did collapse, all of the blame was placed on this scientific community. Fisheries managers, said, no, we wash our hands, it was you guys. You told us, you gave us the wrong numbers, and we just followed them. And that's why there was so much finger pointing. So no one wanted to say that it was domestic overfishing, because that's fisheries management. And that kind of divide lasted for some time. The other thing is that the fisheries managers don't document very often their decisions on paper. But the scientists do. We have working documents, we have research documents, advisory documents, you name it. Massive amounts of paperwork documenting what we do and the decisions that we make. So it's the paper trail in following the fishery management decision side was, and I think still is, very difficult to follow. I used to think of them as horse traders. So I would be at assessment meetings, and they would be in one corner with the fishing industry, and we would be on the other side presenting our results. And it wasn't always clear what those discussions involved. So yeah, I think it's still an issue. I haven't really been inside the assessment process for probably 5 or 6 years now, and I left it probably before that as well when I got into the ecosystem assessment work. But I think you're right. I think there are issues at that level.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more. Elliot?
Yeah, thanks again. And just to follow on from that topic, I was wondering, when you did see change, be it at the management or the policy level, what do you think really stimulated the change? Was it access to the more information that you produced through the status reports, the ecosystem status reports, or was it just the socioeconomic crises that came about from the collapses themselves?
I guess that's a two-part question. I guess the one message I wanted to try to put forward was that when we began the ecosystem assessment, it was really to try to answer those three questions about whether it changed and so forth. We never expected it would reveal some of the research results that we eventually produced, such as the cascading trophic interactions, the context dependency of whether some fisheries collapsed or not. It really was a springboard for probably a decade-long run of research whose foundation was that ecosystem status report. And I guess, as I mentioned, I had it in my abstract, and because I was limited with time, I showed that there were 2 brief reopenings in the cod fishery, and at the time we had a council called the Fisheries Resource Conservation Council. So when the cod collapsed, the government made a concession to try to hand over management to the fishing industry. And that's what this Fisheries Resource Conservation Council did. And they were the ones that allowed these limited fisheries to occur during the moratorium. Those reopenings that occurred were largely because of pressure by the industry on this council that the compensation packages that the government was providing to the fishing industry wasn't enough. So in terms of policy change, I mean, I don't know how to answer that. I can't give you, something definite that say that policy has changed.
Well, thanks for that, and well, thanks again for